So in the previous video, we were able to create our user, and at the end of that, we were redirecting to the account route, which we're getting picked up here in /account on our router, right? This time around, though, our api.account.logged-in is going to be equal to true, which means the users already exist, so we're going to show them their assets, right? And what I've done is I've created this class, new asset, I'm passing in the router and the API, and we're calling .assets on it. So if we look over here in this folder, this is a new folder called asset, we have a bunch of HTML, which is actually what this looks like over here. So you were able to see kind of the end result of, like, by the end of this video we'll have this essentially. So this is our user and they're logged in and we're showing them their icons, how much of each asset they own, and then there's deposit and withdrawals. When we click those, nothing will happen because we haven't written that code yet. So we'll do that in the next video. So all this HTML here, again, this isn't a front-end development course, so we're not going to talk about the front-end stuff. You'll be supplied with all this. This is really just something we need so that we can prove that we're actually interacting with the Mixin network and things are showing up. So there's that, and then there's the assets.html, and this essentially will just for loop through the assets and show them using the CSS and the HTML. So what exactly are these assets here in the assets.html, and that's what we'll talk about next. So as is standard, I have things commented out that I've added in this video. So I'm firstly gonna uncomment the new assets. I think that's everything we need to uncomment in this folder. That is being created on the fly, of course, but here in index.js is where we're creating this asset, and it takes in the router and the API. It also sets its own templates for the assets HTML here and the asset.html here, which is where we're going to inject things that get returned from the Mixin network into both of those HTML files. So we have an assets method here in the asset function, and the first thing that we do is we call self.api.asset, and if you're paying attention, you'll see here in API that there is no asset up until this point, right? We don't have an asset object that's injected into our API function, so I went ahead and wrote that. You can see here I'm importing it from asset.js. I think that's the only line we need to uncomment here because we're just passing it around so that we can use it. You'll see here the code is pretty simple, right? We have preset, and all that's doing is requiring assets.json. We'll look at that in a second. We have a get by ID, pretty standard, and get by sum. So sorry, by sim. So we'll pass in a symbol. We can get any asset based on its symbol. We'll pass in its ID. We can get any asset based on its ID. Where are we getting those from? We're getting those from assets.json. So I've created this JSON file, and all it is a list of assets based on their chain ID, their asset ID. There is a icon URL, which we're going to use the Mixin network to go get the name and then the symbol of the asset. So it's just a kind of a local database, if you will, of existing assets that we already know about. So we're not going to necessarily load, we don't need to load them from the Mixin network every time. We have them here locally. So that's pretty simple, right? Pretty straightforward code, but when we get down here into the asset object, things get a little bit more complex. So essentially all I was saying previously about this is we're pulling this preset. When we call preset on the asset, it's just pulling in these asset objects from the JSON file. So if we, the next thing we do here is we call mixin.assets. So if we go back into the Mixin code that we've written before, where we wrote the create user, the update pin, the encrypted pin, and all those other things, what I've done is I've added a simple call into the API request library that we'd written in the past, and here we're going to call get on the assets route. That's a pretty straightforward call here. We've already written a request, so it's pretty trivial. We don't need to send any parameters in this case because nothing needs signed when you're doing a get on the assets. right? The Mixin network doesn't really care who you are if you're asking for assets, because you're not doing any sort of transfers or anything like that. So back here, when we call assets, the Mixin network is going to respond with some amount of data. And if we go back here and look in the console, you can see that when we every time I refresh this page while we were talking, we were getting data from the Mixin network, and lo and behold, it looks very similar to what we already have in the assets.json. There is an asset ID which happens to match here in the assets.json. If you look at the asset ID, it matches one-to-one with the one that was returned back to us from the Mixin network for the Mixin cryptocurrency. They also have the chain icon URL that they return to us, which we have are in the asset.json as well. The chain ID, same thing. But it also has a couple of extra things here, like the balance. We're not storing that locally. It has the deposit enabled, etc., etc. So the balance of my Mixin, in this case of the wallet that I just created, the balance of my Mixin is 0. So the chain knows when we make an API call, it knows that I don't have any Mixin, essentially, and it's returning that back to us. If I happen to have a balance of, say, 10 Mixin, when we sent that query of get, it would say, you know, you have 10 Mixin, or however many I have. We also have the price symbol, etc., etc., that gets returned to us. So if we look back here in index.js, from there it's like pretty simple operations, right? We have our preset data up here and our return data from the chain here, and what we need to do is kind of like mix those two together. The first thing we're going to do is filter. We're going to store all the ones that we get back from the Mixin network, and we're going to check if those exist in the preset already. So if they already exist in the preset, we're not going to do anything. Otherwise, we're going to update the preset values because they weren't returned to us from the Mixin network. So we're just going to assume that the user doesn't have any balance of these preset currencies. In this case, none of them are preset, right? Because all the ones we have in the asset.json were actually returned to us from the Mixin network. So it's not necessary to do any filtering at that point. After that, we're just going to update the chain icon URL to match the one here locally. This is in case something bad happens with the Mixin network. I'm recording these videos while the network is still kind of in beta. It hasn't launched, and I didn't want users getting kind of confused if, like, you know, icons weren't showing up on the front end while, you know, things are getting reset and tested on the current Mixin network. From there, basically all we're doing is we're passing this into the template assets HTML that I showed you before. This is the assets variable we were talking about before, right? This is a simple for loop iterating through the list of assets, and all it's doing is rendering it with the balance and the symbol, and whether or not deposits are enabled, we can do withdrawals and deposits on that as well. You can see here we're also passing the chain icon, the name, all that other stuff, right? So all we need on the back end, right, is these list of assets that got returned to us by the Mixin network, and we're essentially just piping those forward to the front end where they'll be rendered based on their different attributes. And you can see here, again, looking at the data returned to us, all of this stuff is essentially getting rendered on the front end by that assets.html code. So that is essentially how to get assets from the Mixin network, how to render them, all that other stuff. This is essentially what you're going to get back when you hit that route that I showed you in the Mixin code. I think that's everything. So as you can see here, as I mentioned earlier, when we hit deposit, there's a 404 error. If we hit withdrawal, there's a 404 error. So the next thing we're going to do, and I think this may actually be the last thing we do in the course, is we'll write the deposit and withdrawal code, and then you'll know how to basically do everything you need to do on the Mixin network. Okay, see you in the next video.